Hi there, and welcome to another video from Big Rock Audio. I'm Steve Metcalf, and this is my studio. And the topic of the day is going to be preamps, and it's been a hot topic as of lately after the video produced by Jim Lill talking about how all preamps sound the same. And he knew that it was going to cause some uproar, said so in his video, and it did. So I'm answering the call from that video in my own way. And before I go on to run through the content that I have here, I want to say, first of all, this guy's a pro. His videos are great. The storytelling is great. And it's really obvious to me that he went to great care to try and to be objective, to get to the actual bottom of whether or not preamps did sound different. And I think he really tried hard to do it. But I do think that he missed some important stuff. And the findings that I have here today are going to be very different. And so what we're going to go through, first of all, is I have some tracks that I cut. This is an acoustic guitar. And I've got a few different performances that have been recorded. And we're going to listen to those. And then the other thing I'm going to do when I'm done with that is we're going to have a look at some measurements. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, we're going to talk about why it is that the comparison video that Mr. Lill did was flawed. And to do that, first, I'm going to talk about my snare drum. How is that going to prove my point? Well, a few seconds ago, I hit my snare drum. And I hit it again. And, you know, I think I'm going to hit it one more time. And I'm going to ask you, did you notice any major difference across my three performances of snare drum? To me, they all sounded pretty much exactly the same. But what that snare drum hit gives us is it gives us a little bit of low, a little bit of mid, a little bit of high. It gives us some action from quiet to loud and back to quiet again. And that's what you need to evaluate a preamp, not a sweep or other kind of measurements. Here's why. A microphone and a preamp have a really complicated interaction between them, and it does depend to a certain extent what type of microphone that you use. And I'm going to use this Shure SM57 as an example. This isn't a terribly complicated mic for a preamp to use, pretty friendly, really. But what happens is there's an impedance relationship between the microphone and the preamp. And impedance, as you may know, is a resistance to electrical flow that varies with frequency. So in other words, the way that the electricity flows back and forth is going to be different at 100 hertz than it is at 1,000, at 10,000, and so on. And what Jim did in his video was very logical at first glance. Let's take this microphone, let's take one performance, let's split this into two different preamps and compare them. But when you split the electrical signal, you modify that relationship with the impedance, and you don't get the same sort of result. First of all, that's if you split it with a Y cable. Now, if you say, well, Y cables are for amateurs, we're not going to use that. We're going to get a proper splitter box and do that. Well, that's fine, but the proper splitter box has its own electronics in it, and they do two things. One, they add their own color, their own flavor a little bit, and two, they somewhat isolate the impedance relationship of the microphone from the preamp. And then when you're done with your comparison of that type, then you take a tone generator and you connect the line out from that to the line in on your mic preamp, and you test that with the sweep. And here's another problem. At that point, it's not a mic preamp. It's a line preamp. And the impedance relationship between that tone generator and your preamp that you're testing is very simple, not at all complicated. And pretty much any preamp you put in there, you're going to get relatively the same kind of result. So then the question becomes, how is it that we can tap in and find out what the differences are from one preamp to the next preamp? Well, there's going to be the presentation of the overall frequency range with the content that's happening. So you can't just measure one tone at 1,000 hertz, you have to have all the different compositions of the sound happening at one time. You want to take a look at saturation levels. One of the reasons why somebody wants a transformer coupled preamp is because of the pleasing saturation that the transformer offers. So that's something that you need to look at. You need to look at how transients are handled. They're very sharp, dramatic rises in voltages. And a lot of preamps have the effect of attenuating, shaving, softening those transients, which again has an effect on the sound. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to run through this, and then I've got some measurements to prove it. And we're not going to take too terrible long to do it, but let's bring about our workstation here. And I'm just going to start with the first track. All right, so there you have it. We've got 7 different tracks. Now, to talk a little bit about how these tracks were done, when I set this up, I used a meter to level match all of the mic inputs and setting the gain so that the input level came out the same to the workstation. Then, once the tracks were recorded, I used the normalization function to computer normalize the volume, increase the volume slightly or decrease it as would be required to match each of them in level, because we don't want people naturally think that if it sounds louder it must have better detail and so on and so forth, and we want them to basically sound the same. Once that was done, I understand that the computer analysis of what's loud can differ from what your ear perceives. So I took some time and I listened to each of them, and I made some fine-tuning adjustments to ensure that they sounded about the same loudness to me. And it's tough because there is a different frequency response from one to the next. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at these measurements, and I think you'll find this kind of interesting as we go through it. So let me bring this up here on the screen now. So the first measurement we have there up in the top corner on the left is crest factor. And this is the overall dynamic range of the signal. Now, since in each take, what I'm doing is I'm strumming the guitar about the same amount with the same pick, we've got this difference in dynamic range. Why? Well, let's take a look at the different preamp options that we have. First of all, we have SSL. Clean, that means there's no fancy stuff, no funny business. And they're very good preamps. They're very neutral and transparent preamps. And you can see that's got the highest crest factor, meaning that it preserved the dynamic range of the signal the most out of all. Since it's the first track I recorded, it's going to be our reference track. Now we take a look at SSL 4K. What is that? Well, SSL is trying to bring the character of the 4K console into the modern preamp with the circuit that they designed. That circuit includes both saturation and also an EQ lift. And we'll see about the EQ lift as we go, but saturation is effectively distortion, is another way of talking about it. Like, it's not, but it is. And saturation has sort of a natural effect of compressing things. One of the reasons guys like tape, analog tape, is because there's a natural compression that happens with tape saturation. So moving right along, we see the Audient HDX. HDX is Audient's emulation of tube preamp. They use MOSFET circuitry to produce this, but it is saturation. The next one we have is iron, which is actually a transformer in the circuit, and the transformer adds saturation. And then we have both HDX tube emulation and iron transformer saturation working together. Then we have the same Audient preamp with none of that stuff in there. And then we have the Soundcraft, which also has none of that stuff. And what you notice is that as the saturation increases steadily, the dynamic range decreases steadily. And that is to be expected because that's one of the things that saturation does, is it offers this compression effect and it softens sharp things, transients like a snare hit or the pick stroke. And you'll probably notice that when you listen from one to the next, that there is some difference in timbre from one track to the next. So if we go to level summary, we're going to see how good my ears are for matching volume. And we notice that the lowest is 17.9 on the Soundcraft and the highest is 18.4 on the HDX. And so what's happening here is basically the smoother the preamp, the louder it is. And when we start to bring in, the louder I make it. Because when we start to bring in the saturation and it starts to smooth things over, it sounds very nice and you want to try and turn things up to make it appear to sound the same. And so what I've done is I'm sort of psychoacoustically compensating for the increased softness of the saturation by increasing the volume. And quite honestly, a full range of 0.5 dB across the board, I'm going to be pretty happy with that. And I think from a standpoint of avoiding confirmation bias, this is acceptable. Now we'll move on to spectral balance quick. You can see with the SSL, there's a relative level in decibels from everything all the way down. You can see that, there's more high frequency losses, for example, on the HDX and iron, whereas the SSL 4K that we know has a lift in the high, you can see that lift. We'll move along here on the topic to number 5, the difference spectrum. So right along the 0 line here, that's where SSL would be. The other graphs show the variance in frequency response. Most of it tends to be in the low mid range and in the high frequency range, as you can see on the graph, but there's some distinct differences. And on envelope, which is basically a snapshot, if you look at the far left of envelope and the far right, imagine a guitar being strummed. The pick stroke is on the left, the decay of the note is on the right, and this is an average amplitude envelope over the entire track to show what each preamp does and how it handles those things. And then we've correlated this to the similarity to the first one, which is most similar and which is least similar. And you can see that clearly there. And then the color index. Once again, when people are talking about color, they're talking about distortions and saturations that are, pleasing. This is why we want to go from one preamp to the next. So I think, if you go through and you listen to that a few times, good pair of headphones, good pair of speakers, what have you, I think you'll probably agree that each of them sounds different. I think it also makes sense with the way that I perform the test, with the mic at the same distance, the same guitar, all done at the same time. Much like the snare drum, it makes sense that there isn't going to be that much of a difference in the sound from one playing track to the next, that what we're looking at is actually the difference between preamps. So the 3 preamps I have here, they're all good quality products. They're all regarded as being quite clean and quite accurate, but they don't present the same signal in the same way. And you'll find if you experiment, try different microphones with the same preamp, try different gain levels. Gain staging is something that maybe I should do a video on gain staging so we understand how that matters. So that's it. That's what I've got. That is my opinion that preamps do not all sound alike. What do you think? Did I do a good job of that? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.